Business on Purpose podcast.
Have you ever given yourself to the discipline of deep practice? Hey, it's Scott Beebe with the Business on Purpose podcast, and it is time to be liberated from the chaos of working in your business and to get your life back. Recently reading a book called The Talent Code, and I apologize, I forget I think it's Daniel Coyle off the top of my head. Just Google it, The Talent Code. Interesting book. And it's talking about the reality of how talent is not born, it's developed. And it's developed over consistency and time. The author relays a story about a singer that I appreciate whose name is Ray LaMontagne. Do your best to search for that name, but it's an interesting name and I think you ought to look it up. And maybe listen to a tune or two from Ray LaMontagne. Ray, at 22 years old, as the author relays the story, really did not have much musical prowess or skill. But at 22 years old, he made a decision, working in a manufacturing area within the state of Maine, that he wanted to become a singer-songwriter. And so at 22, he essentially locked himself in his apartment. His friends thought he had left town. His neighbors thought he had functionally gone mad. And for 2 straight years, he devoted himself to musical discipline, to practice, to playing, to singing, to writing, to composing. And he said, I sang until it hurt. And eventually I just began to sing. As the story is told, just 8 years after that time, when he was 22 years old, his album sold 500,000 copies. 8 years. How did he do it? Well, it's what the author would call deep practice. Maybe Cal Newport of the book Deep Work might call it deep work. But it's the idea that not just kicking a ball around, but kicking a ball around with special focus, kicking the ball around with special intensity, kicking the ball around with, maybe this is the word, repetition. Not just doing the same thing over and over and over again, but doing the right same thing over and over and over again, developing skill and habit. He talks about the Brazilian soccer legacy, why so many brilliant British football players in the history of the world, they actually don't tail it back to football, they tail it back to something called futsal. Futsal being a smaller game, played faster with a smaller ball in a smaller space. And it requires a lot more skill and a lot more deep practice, focused work. And so all of a sudden a Brazilian can be on a regular sized football field, be surrounded by defenders and start to do things maneuverably that most other football players are not capable of doing because they spent hours and days and weeks and months and years practicing on the smaller things. The author even goes into neurology and talks about the myelin sheaths that circle the nerve fibers. And every time you practice, that sheath gets a little thicker. And when that sheath gets thicker, the impulse fires faster. And so the reason that a world-class athlete, a world-class cellist can play and fire faster and faster and faster is because of the deep practice. He's got a great statement that I'll paraphrase. If you miss a day of practice, you might notice. If you miss 2 days of practice, your spouse might notice. But if you miss the 3rd day of practice, the world will begin to notice. Some of the world's great talents don't miss a day of practice. In the U.S. right now, we're in the middle of the NFL playoffs, the NFL football playoffs. And you've got a couple of the greatest quarterbacks in the history of the NFL, Drew Brees, and then, of course, Tom Brady. Still to this day in their 40s, and Drew Brees is almost 40. They are practicing the art and the discipline of deep practice. Tom Brady even said it himself before a game, still at this age, with multiple Super Bowls under his belt, and likely will be touted as the best quarterback of all time. Still goes to work every week in deep practice, watching film out on the field. We want to build great businesses, but are we willing to put in the deep practice? Are Are we willing to specify our weekly schedule time to go into the deep practice of getting the work done? One of the ways you can do it is by articulating that in your vision as part of the freedom section. I want to spend more time in the practice of my work. Reading, writing, practicing, doing, failing, learning, and growing. We'll see you next time, right here on the Business on Purpose podcast.